can I just say one thing firstly? I love the name Eat Sleep Boxing Repeat.
ESBR Boxing, we are back, myself and my main man, Owen McKendry. We are here in final predictions mode, sorry, not preview mode, final prediction mode, and we are making our predictions known for the WBO World Welterweight title clash between Brian Norman Jr. and Devin Haney. But before we get to that, so I'd say like and subscribe to the channel. We've got all your boxing needs up and under one roof. So like and subscribe to that. Let us know what you think to the content, etc. That'll help us inform our content going forward. But Owen, thank you very much for joining me. As always, an absolute pleasure. Obviously, let's get into this one here. Devin Haney versus Brian Norman Jr. I think obviously no, you don't need to introduce these two really too significantly. I mean, Devin Haney obviously 32 and 0, Brian Norman Jr. 28 and 0, both undefeated. Brian Norman Jr. can bang. Devin Haney less so. But the question really is, I want to ask you first and foremost, is who wins this one, Owen, and how?
I think yeah, like you say, it's a puncher against a boxer. Probably more chance of getting struck by lightning than Devin Haney stopping Brian Norman Jr. If he does stop him, I'll definitely be putting the lottery on after saying that. I think Devin Haney wins this on points. Brian Norman Jr. hasn't fought half the names that Devin Haney has. Devin Haney's coming for a lot of criticism recently. The Ryan Garcia fiasco, etc. But you look at some of the names on his record, the likes of, as controversial as it was, someone like Lomachenko is an absolute million miles away from the fighters Brian Norman Jr. has been knocking out. I think you have to respect a puncher. 22 stoppages in 28 fights is pretty impressive. But yeah, I just think Devin Haney will be too skillful. As some would say, probably run for most of the fight. But yeah, I think Haney will be done with a fairly comfortable unanimous decision points victory.
Yeah, you know what? I think I'm going to agree with you on this one. I think Devin Haney's a skilled fighter. I think he's obviously quite negative. I think what happened with the Ryan Garcia fight has obviously been etched from his record. And obviously we know what happened after that as well, and all the weights and all that sort of stuff as well. So it's kind of like I've given a bit of a pass there. And like some of the names you mentioned, obviously Loma, some of the other sort of champions that he's beaten. I mean, even recently the likes of Prograve, you got like Gamboa, obviously all those sort of names in there as well. I think he'll be. I think I have too much for Brian Norman Jr. Like you said, I think you've got to kind of respect Brian Norman Jr.'s power. Obviously, we saw him that sort of sickening KO victory last time out that he put on that lad in Japan. So obviously the power is there. Whether he can catch Devin Haney, yes, of course he could catch Devin Haney. He could stop Devin Haney possibly, obviously up at welterweight as well. Knows a more natural welterweight, but I think
Mhm.
I just still expect Devin Haney to have too much. And frankly, and like you said, I think there'll be an element of going backwards. There'll be an element of sort of obviously using the jab. But I think Haney on points here is how I'm going to go as well. But let me just pick you up on that. Obviously, we mentioned both some of those names there on Devin Haney's record. And obviously, though, he's fought obviously at lightweight, super lightweight, coming up to welter for this, where obviously Norman Jr. is the champion. So I suppose my question for you is where would this actually rank for Devin Haney's victory against some of those names and some of those accomplishments he's already made if he were to become a world champion here against Brian Norman Jr.?
I think because it makes him a three-weight world champion, it ranks quite highly, only because of that factor. I think when you look at Regis Prograis, some of the fights he's been in, Lomachenko, etc., beating Brian Norman Jr. isn't going to do much for your CV. If you were to go out in the street and ask 100 people, do they know who Lomachenko is, and ask 100 people, do they know who Brian Norman Jr. is, it's going to be significantly higher for Lomachenko. And unfortunately, that's not the measure of how successful a boxer is. But in today's world, with all the influencer aspects and whatnot, the casual aspect weighs heavy. So I think for me, obviously Lomachenko is an all-time great within those weights. When he fighting for world titles in like his third fight or something ridiculous like that, unbelievable fighter. But you've also then got the casual aspect, and no disrespect to Brian Norman Jr., but probably 95% of boxing fans won't know who Brian Norman Jr. is. So it'll rank fairly highly because of the weight behind it. You can say he's a three-weight world champion. But yeah, in terms of the actual opponent, it's just in there with many of the victories for me.
Yeah, I think people like, controversy sells in these videos, and we'd love to sit here and have a bit of an argument. But I actually totally agree with what you're saying there. I think, I think It'll be a good victory in the sense that it's obviously up at a bigger weight. That's where the factor is. But I think for me, obviously the victory over Lomachenko is probably the sort of high watermark. Even though you can sit there and go, well, actually Lomachenko, arguably himself, fighting wasn't necessarily even fighting at the sort of weight that he was comfortable at. Really, he's probably smaller than the weights he was competing against. But then you look at it and go, Devin Haney doesn't really pack a massive punch either. So it's like he didn't necessarily have that equaliser against Lomachenko, and Lomachenko is obviously technically significantly better than Brian Norman Jr. But I'd probably have it up there, maybe sort of around beneath that possibly. But I think it all depends to be seen, really. I suppose we're saying this now, but if Devin Haney was going to go in there, jab his way to a kind of like 120, 108, or like kind of 118, 110 kind of victory, I think like you said, I don't think outside of boxing, I don't think he'd do a lot for the CV. Frankly, like if you look at this in a couple of years' time, it might not be as credible as I'm putting it, but at the moment I'll probably have it just up underneath that Lomachenko victory. But last question before we go from me. Obviously, you mentioned it there. Three-weight world champion Haney would be here. Light, super light, welter. How far do you think he can go? Obviously, you look at like super welterweight. You've got obviously some monsters up there. Obviously, Ortiz seen last weekend from when we're filming this. Obviously, the likes of like Madrimov, Fundora, those sort of names that are like up there. Do you think he can compete in that division, or do you think this is probably the limit for him with his frame and size, etc.?
Um, He could probably compete with a couple of names like Abbas Baru is WBA champion. I can't remember if he's super or just WBA regular, but that would still make him a four-weight world champion. So when you look at the names like that, he'd definitely be able to compete with them. I think, like you say, then you've got your Virgil Ortiz Jr., your Boots Ennis up there. It gets a bit. That's when it gets interesting. But you've also got, I think, the WBO champions Xander Zayas. Haven't seen much of him, so I think there's bouts to be won because they're spread about. But if the likes of Fundora, Ortiz start unifying them, then I think it becomes a bit of a problem. But he can definitely step up another weight, without a doubt. He can definitely step up and compete. But how far he can compete depends on who's still around at the weight because obviously Boots is an absolute superstar. And you'd back him to beat Haney. Well, I would anyway. But the fact of you've got the Xander Zayas, you've got Abbas Baru up there. There's bouts to be won. Can claim a four-weight world champion, and unfortunately in boxing now you could be an IBO champion in four weights, at 5, 6 weights. If you went from bantamweight all the way through, flyweight, bantamweight, etc., and won an IBO in every one, you could claim a six-weight world champion. So I think Haney will probably stick around at welter, now and super welter, around those. But yeah, I think he's been down at light and super lightweight, but with Boots Ennis going up to super welter, I think this leaves the door open for the bouts. But he could definitely go up and compete. But we've gone from the super welter and middleweight being quite poor divisions to being fairly open with some decent champions.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think that, I mean, maybe like you said it there, maybe you should just drop into the kind of misfits cars and fight, some sort of accountant for the Super Lightweight title over there or something. But I think I think he could possibly compete up there. I do think I mean, £7 difference, I think, between the two weights is quite significant. But I think if he gets someone that's not a puncher, he could definitely compete. If he gets one of those guys that is a bit of a puncher, obviously, and filled out a bit more, then obviously really sort of struggle. But I think he's got the sort of style to sort of make it a bit negative. Whether he can kind of, like I say, get him with someone who can't necessarily hurt him and then maybe sort of get a points for each, I think he could definitely compete. So that's kind of where we're at. I think probably beyond that, probably really stretching it. But I think I agree with you. Like he could definitely compete up there. But in that is sadly all we have time for in this final prediction. So guys, let us obviously know who you think is going to win out of Haney and Brian Norman Jr. here. Whether you give Norman Jr. a puncher's chance, whether you think Haney on points, as well as where this victory ranks and how far you think Devin Haney can go in this division and beyond. Owen. As always, thank you very much for joining me, guys. As always, like and subscribe to the channel. We've got all your boxing needs up under one roof, and we'll see you again for more final predictions soon. Thank you very much, Owen. Bye bye.
Cheers, mate.